Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you this morning. Really excited to welcome our guest, Kamau Franklin, to the show again. I think actually the first time since we've done the video stuff, which is, I know he's going to chastise me for that. But before we get started, make sure to do the things, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, share it within your social media networks and pages and so on. Support the channel if you have not already. You can do that on Patreon or through Buy Me a Coffee, which also allows one-time contributions. So our guest today, Kamau Franklin, is the founder of Community Movement Builders. He's been a dedicated organizer for over 30 years and was a leading member of a national grassroots organization dedicated to the ideas of self-determination and the teachings of Malcolm X. Done a lot of organizing. There's a more complete bio in the show description, but we're really here today. We'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about Community Movement Builders, but we're really here to talk about the National Black Radical Organizing Conference, which is going to be happening later this month in Indianapolis at Butler University. And I believe this is the second one. So I'll bring Kamau to the stage at this point and he can start to fill in some of the details on this. But, really excited to be hosting this conversation and talking with him about what's going on.
Hey.
Kamau, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me again. Yeah, it's been a while, you know what I'm saying. I used to be your favorite guest, I thought, for a brief period of time. And then let me also mention Black Liberation Media, so I don't get killed for not mentioning Black Liberation Media.
Yes,
so all part
absolutely.
of it.
No, shout out to Black Liberation Media and all the work that you and everybody does over there for sure. So let's just start with like kind of a who, what, when, where, why of this Black Radical Organizing Conference. You did this last year, I know. Was that the first year that you all had done it?
We did it first in 2023. So that was, and so we made it like a biannual conference. And it was the first year we did it. I'll go into it a little bit, like, part of the idea behind doing the first one was that I just didn't see a space individually where we as Black radicals, meaning folks that I work with or organize with or around the country, we're not having sort of gatherings or unified conversations, right? So obviously this is historically something that's happened in the past, but it felt like it's been a few years since I'd seen that type of gathering. And it was like, I think because of the work we were doing on Cop City at the time, we were in a decent position to say, okay, let's call this, let's talk to some of our partner organizations, our sister organizations, see who would be interested in coming. We had raised some money, and so had a little bit of pot of money to spend on something like this. And we capped it, I think, at first at about 200 and 250, and we had over 300 people register. So we was like, okay, this was something that seems to be a space people are looking for and wanted to have. And we had a great conference, 2 days, mostly plenary sessions, talking through some of the issues and ideas. And again, it's a lot of work to pull together a conference we're a grassroots organization. So we don't have some full big staff that's doing all this kind of stuff. So it's a lot of work to do such a thing. And so then we decided to try to do it again this year.
Right on. I had to laugh at this comment. My mom is not happy that y'all are dragging her daughter out into Klan.
It wasn't my idea too. So another organizer that we work closely with after our first one, which we did do in Atlanta, two Black from Black Alliance for Peace, had the idea that Indianapolis would be a great place to do a second conference. And of course, my first inclination was, are there a lot of Black folks in Indiana, in Indianapolis? I don't know these things or whatever. And he ran down sort of the history, obviously including the Gary, Indiana conference in 72, 73, which was one of the first major gatherings, I'd say, in the Black Power era. Even if that was towards the end of the Black Power era, that was kind of like, hey, again, the space is needed. They had thousands show up. Some of the similar arguments that folks will have today, folks are having back then. In fact, Two Black brings up One of the things that became a point of friction was Palestine at the time. I think if anybody reads some of the historical record, they'll also see some of the similar struggles between nationalist formations and, let's say, more labor or socialist formations that are more integrationist in mindset. Those became areas of splits. There's obviously sometimes egos involved. But there was a lot that came out of the conference in terms of the gathering that unified certain sectors of the larger Black community. And so he, for various reasons, thought it was in the Midwest was a good place where we could gather people, get people to come around from, of course, from around the country, but particularly in the Midwest area, Chicago, St. Louis, some other places that have been hotspots for Black organizing over the last few years. And very easily just talked me into saying that this is where we should do it. And he would do a lot of the groundwork to make it happen. And so that's how we wound up in Klan Country in Indianapolis, which I just saw that the lieutenant governor of Indiana made a statement around how the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution was something that was, again, good for the country and good for African people, and something that we should be, thankful for in a lot of ways. And it was the beginning of the ending of slavery. And so all that nonsense spewing could be from any politician around the country, but it just so happened it was like, oh, great, this is the guy who's, or have him give an opening for us or something.
Right on. Well, at least it's strategically kind of in the middle of the country, so it's easy for people to get to without too much travel from any area. So talk a little bit about kind of some of the themes, some of the things that you all are going to be, doing at this conference,
Mhm.
some of the discussions, but also, some of the maybe goals or aims that you're kind of looking to get
Mhm.
into a little bit in this conference.
So again, coming out of the first conference and 2 years later, obviously a lot has happened, right? So a continual organizing, but the election of Trump, coming obviously clearly out of COVID. For us who are doing Cop City work, now that Cop City is being built, national or has been built, national efforts around the country by state politicians to build cop cities, and obviously the encampments over Palestine. So there's been a lot of organizing and action that's happened in those 2 years. And a lot of which reflects on where our larger community is in terms of Black folks, in terms of being separated by the divide of lesser of two evil politics, particularly for those on the Black left, lesser of two evil politics versus sort of a more self-determination politics. And talks and conversations about that abound, and struggles have happened over those conversations. And then I will also say, I think, as much as we don't like to discuss this, there's been a weakening. I think some of it is more obvious than not of the centrality of leftist Black politics in Black communities, right? I think there was at one point in our history where Black politics that were left of center might have even been the predominant or close to the predominant politics in our community. But since the destruction of the Black Power movement, of Black nationalist groups, of Black socialist groups, via COINTELPRO and other mechanisms and means, the opening up of a nonprofit sector as a way for us to direct our organizing through, the opening up of some voting rights for us to direct our efforts through voting and strictly policy change as the way in which we engage political struggle and battles. It's meant a weakening of the left, or particularly the radical left. It doesn't mean groups don't exist. It doesn't mean at times there hasn't been high points where groups have come back. But I would say sort of like something that's in depth and is dug deep in our community, we're not there anymore, at least in my estimation. But I think those politics are powerful and still useful and at the center of any kind of liberation struggle that would happen. We need a space, and where space is, this may not be the only space, where different groups who are along those sort of political lines come together to debate, discuss, strategize, plan, and figure out ways forward together. And so the main purpose of the conference, coming out of the last 2 years has been, where do we do that and how do we do that? So part of the first opening plenary session is basically an overview of how did we get to this position, right? How did we get here? in terms of the politics that are driving America. Now, obviously, this is the first time we've had white nationalism at the centerpiece of the U.S. government, but it's more overt than it's been in a long time, right? And where it's okay almost to be openly white nationalist and not be apologetic about it and not be chastised or moved out of mainstream politics. Neoliberalism still exists, but it is now being battled against by these sort of still capitalists, but capitalists who want to turn to an era of the night. I have this debate with people around which era in the past the white nationalists are trying to return to. My estimation is segregation, 1950-ish. Others are telling me like, no. People are trying to go back to post-Reconstruction. And then there's others who are saying, no, they're trying to go strictly 1863, 1861, 1850s or whatever. But all that to say is that there's a politics that has happened that has led us to this point that has allowed white nationalists to overtly control the politics of not only America, but the politics that control our community, to be quite frank. And I think there's been sort of a false idea that we would be able to vote our way out of this, or that by voting, we could be integrated, let's say, into, as Martin Luther King is famous for saying, a burning house. And I think that's led us to a dead end. And so part of our conversations is that those politics. Why are we here in this particular setting? What's happened to Black radical politics that are not at the forefront anymore? Why do we have politics like that are saying that we're not even Africans, probably having a bigger impact online than Black leftist politics, right? Two is what is to be done, the Lenin term. So what are we doing with this knowledge of where we're at? None of our organizations by themselves are powerful enough to quote unquote overthrow capitalism or even enact real control over our community. But there is enough of us nationwide, internationally, that can hold a fragment of resistance if we could only pull it together. And part of this conference is about how do we begin to pull that together in a way that's meaningful and impactful for the larger Black community. So it's not about having our organizations or collectives that's 7 people or 10 people or 20 people, or some of us a few hundred people, but it doesn't matter if we're not acting on the same accord, working as Amiri Baraka famously said, who at one point facilitated the Gary Indianapolis conference, unity without uniformity. How do we get back there? So we want to talk about that as another opening plenary session, our second plenary section. And then there's a skill building workshops for organizers. How do we skill build? And campaign building workshops. What are some current campaigns? What are other campaigns that we should be working on or doing? Lastly, what I consider the most controversial of the plenary sessions is one on electoral politics, right? What should we be doing in this arena, if anything? There's some people who are probably way far left, who's like any participation in electoral politics is basically capitulation to the state. I think there's others who think that there are avenues in which it's a political arena, and so you cannot divest from that arena. It's a place where there's a lot of people who still believe in it, and there are some safety issues on, I would say, local, but also national politics that at the very least need to be considered. And whether or not any of that can be done through the Democrat, none of it can be done through the Republican Party, of course, but whether any of it can safely be said to be done in the Democratic Party, whether or not there's any space that we should be holding in that party, and or again, whether or not we should be building, if we're going to do that kind of work, independent political parties. There are some folks who are even arguing still at this, do we need a independent Senate, a People's Senate, where not just Black folks, but folks who are radical or left or organizers come together and use that as a mechanism for making decisions. So there's a lot of discussion around that. And then lastly, the last part of the conference is breaking into different groups and areas and saying, what is it that we can work out of here doing together, right? So what's the next steps? Always the famous thing for conferences that people have debates about. Oh, it's a conference. It's just a lot of talking and everything else, but nothing comes out of it. I think there's value in a conference on its own, but I also understand the idea of coming to something and leaving and everybody seems to be in a good mood, but no follow-up. So we have spaces for that follow-up. what are, like, is there mutual aid programs that we can get down with across the country and work together on? Community self-defense, important. I know community self-defense, not know your rights, because at this stage, know your rights may have some importance, but it is not important as it was a year, 100 days ago, maybe longer than that. Obviously, I don't want to blame everything on the Republicans, but obviously those things are less important, at least in our estimation, as opposed to community defense. Again, electoral spaces, what should we be doing in those spaces? And so about four throughout, there's like 3 or 4 of those spaces that's going to be held for people to have conversations. Human rights as an international area of concern and fighting back. So how do we make this stuff happen post the conference? Continue having organizations, collectives, and individuals work with each other, and then at some point come back together to continue that work, maybe in 2 more years, or to see where we're at, what's gotten built out of that work. Is it something that's like, that we can continue to use? I'm sure there'll be some failures and things that won't come out of it, but what are the chances that we're taking on each other and working with each other during that time period? So that's and it's going to be a rally at the very end. The Pendleton 2 political prisoners who are located in Indianapolis. We want folks to rally and demonstrate and give them support. And that'll be hopefully lifting up sort of a national profile that they have, and bringing them into the idea, or into the discussion around political prisoners in a way which I think they have not been in the past.
Right on. Thank you for laying all that out. One of the things I was going to ask you is, I know you've been through other conferences and like this historically and so on, but having the experience of having done this particular conference in 2023, what did you feel like? Did you feel like people walked away with certain tangible things? Did you feel like there were maybe relationships that were strengthened between organizations? I'm just kind of curious from your perspective of whether you feel like everybody did kind of go their separate ways, or whether there was some concrete things that you felt like came out of that.
Yeah, I think there were a few concrete things that came out. And I think that was one of the best parts about trying to do another one. One, again, was the mass gathering of folks who, the way things operate these days, have seen each other on these screens, but never met each other in person. And so the networking that takes place, the conversations that takes place, the follow-up around different ideas. We, as an organization, Community Movement Builders, came out of that conference with 4 more chapters, because more folks decided that they wanted to get down with us and do work with us. Other formations decided to join on to our formation and become a larger organization. So now we went from approximately 3 or 4 chapters at that particular point in time to now having 9 chapters across the country. And most of that was because of the work we did on that conference. And people kept asking for more. I mean, one critique that came out the conference was that it was all big plenary sessions and not enough time for people to do the interacting that they wanted to do in a formal way, to develop processes, to develop ideas, to skill build, and so forth. And that was a major ask, and so something that we continue to do. We covered it live on Black Liberation Media at the time. I think it was Black Power Media. So even doing that, increased the idea of people understanding and knowing that there are a few places where Black folks are having these conversations on an ongoing basis. So I think that was something else that took place that came out of it. And again, there's always a sharpening of politics, and sometimes we take that for granted. But there's a sharpening of politics that can happen from these conferences, because we have people who've been doing this work for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, 10 years, 5 years even, but who are coming and laying out different work that they're in. And there was a lot of folks, just taking notes, having the side meetings with we had a bunch of the former political prisoners there, Black Panther Party members, BLA members. And that'll happen again, but people who are willing to share their time and experiences. So those things came out of it, and it was enough that came out of it. It was like, I think there was something missing. And again, we tried to cap it at 250 and got over 300, and then we capped it at that because of the space requirements. This time we are capping it at approximately 500. We've already sold people, I guess what we should say, registered over 340 people. So already it's a bigger conference than what it was 2 years ago. So there seems to be amongst the Black left an urge to do something like this, to see where it can lead to see where we can interact with, to build bigger institutions, to build more larger organizations. So again, some of that started with this first conference, and we hope that this second conference will allow that to progress even a little bit further.
Yeah, right on. And we should say there is a link in the show description. People can still sign up, even though it is later on this month. Is there anything you want to say about that, about like kind of the logistical elements of it?
Well, yeah, people can go to communitymovementbuilders.org. There's a header there that directly links people to signing up for the conference. Hotels, we had 3 or 4 particular hotels we were using. Those are starting to fill up. So there's several more hotels, of course, that people can go to outside of our network. So we do want people as fast as possible to make sure that they are doing everything they can to register, to become a part of the conference. We have an outline, not a full one, but an outline of what the schedule is. Excuse me. Obviously, providing different food for folks to eat and enjoy in the evening on Saturday. We have DJ. We're going to do an open mic and all that kind of stuff. So some time to relax and folks to come together. So logistically, we hope to make it something where people, again, have enough time to do some networking and organizing, some tabling, going to the different, plenary sessions and workshops and learning something. And the big thing for me, again, is that what can come out of it in terms of what institutions or what type of organizing we think we can build that keeps us closer together, that makes us want to work more together. Those for me are the important things. But logistically speaking, we have about 25 days left before the actual conference. And we know how, folks like to move a little later in time. But I haven't even bought my ticket yet, to be honest, my airline ticket. So after this show, I'm going to go and do that, my airline ticket. But so please, try to book as soon as you can so that we know what the numbers are to expect and that we're ready for you. And and it's a grassroots conference. So please don't come looking for all the things that your job may pay for, that you may be used to at bigger conferences. It's going to be a pretty good sized conference, but we're not here to meet all your particular needs and so forth. Please struggle with us. We're going to get a lot of things right, but there's some things we're going to get wrong. And a lot of this, overwhelming majority of this is going to be volunteer labor. And so, take that in mind. We will have childcare for folks also. So for folks who will bring in their young ones also, to let that be known.
That's awesome. That's great that you're doing that. All right. So one question, a few people asked if there's any remote options. And I was just going to ask, does Black Liberation Media plan to cover at least some of the panels and things like that, or plenaries?
Yeah, so Black Liberation Media will cover all 3 major plenary sessions on Friday evening, Saturday morning, and Sunday morning. Because we have about 6 or 7 concurrent workshops and then another 6 or 7 concurrent campaign workshops, I'll call them, later on the same day. Those will probably not be covered via on air. But if something is in a main room as a workshop, that may get covered. So at the very least, the 3 major plenary sessions will be on Black Liberation Media for people to listen in. We'll keep an open chat for people to chat and have discussion there. So we definitely will have space for folks to, and we will record some of the smaller sessions for later on. So we will definitely have space for folks to participate who can't actually make it physically.
Right on. Awesome. Do you all plan to talk? So one of the things I always think is something that, organizations talk about it, but I think maybe it's become more of a topic of conversation in recent years, but the question of having strategies, right? Of developing strategy for your organization. And I know you did mention the campaign discussions. I do want to talk to you a little bit about some of the organizer skill stuff, because I'm interested in that too. But I think this has been a criticism, and I don't know how much you share it, that some organizations kind of, they mobilize a lot, they do certain things, but it's not really clear that there's a strategy that connects these things together. And is that something that you all discuss?
It is something we're going to discuss, particularly in terms of what is to be done. So our second plenary session, and we have an organizing workshop. So those are things. Yeah, I mean, I think we should take those critiques very seriously, right? One, I don't fall into what I consider the trap of thinking that every sort of historical thing that we look at and we talk about the success, i.e., the Montgomery bus boycott, sometimes the civil rights work, sometimes the Panthers, and then when someone writes about them, they write about them as if they were all planned out, that folks knew exactly what they were doing, that they knew if they did A, it would lead to B. History is not like that, and organizing is not like that, right? So, although I'm a big proponent of, at the very least, having an understanding about what your work is supposed to lead to, right? If you're doing political education, why are you doing political education? What is supposed to come out of the political education? Is it just to make people smarter and brighter? Or is it because it's something that's supposed to be applied by organizers to make them better organizers? Is it supposed to be something that politicizes people so they know how to talk about a line and or to keep politics in command or a struggle, right? So that they don't make sort of faux pas and fall back on things that they used to think, as opposed to things that politically inclined people should be thinking and should be talking about. Does it help us improve our ability to reach people, right? So sometimes I see people doing, I'm just using this as an example, political education, and it's almost like it's political education for political education's sake, and there's never any end to it, right? It's never like it leads to something. Strategy and like how does mobilizing lead to or lead from just mobilizing to increasing your organizational participation by the people you're mobilizing, right? How do you measure that? Simply by counting how many people join. Do other formations come out of it? Did you win something? Or if you lost something, how do you measure how close you came and what were the gains and failures of it, right? So I think a lot of that, sometimes even when things are haphazard or they get started because there's a need to start them, or something happens and we're reacting to it, a lot of times we are almost doing it as a reaction and not necessarily also as a building block for better organizing and strategic planning. And so we're going to do these things, and we're not necessarily going to win all of our battles or all of our struggles. What other things can we measure success by? Can we measure it again because the organizational capacity increased? Can we measure it because more people got involved in movement work? Can we measure it because some outside group was started because of it? What are the ways in which we are showing that this work is making a bigger impact on even if it's online work? Simple measurements around the growth of a channel, and can you call a mass mobilization or ask people to show up someplace off camera, and will they show, right? There's ways in which you have to begin to measure the impact of these things. Otherwise, they become things that make us feel good or make us feel like we're doing work, but we're not having the larger impact as to why we all say we want to organize, which is to win people over, to get them organized and to get them active. And to me, that's the strategy. It's like, how do you do that? And how do you measure it so that you're just not continually doing the same thing over and over again and not having any different results from it?
Yeah, thank you. Two Black also said that Max, I'm assuming this is Max from PACA,
Mm-hmm.
will be doing his mission, objective, strategies, and tactics workshop too, which
Mm-hmm.
speaks to this question. Um, right on. I guess another question is the organizing skills. So one of the things that you said is that at the last conference, this was something that people asked for, was more stuff around organizing. And I think this is, there's a lot of people that say the word organizing or do some kind of organizing, whether it's mutual aid or whatever. But they're not necessarily, I think there's an assumption sometimes that people have training that maybe even don't. And I think that's I mean, there are trainings out there, there are trainings available that people can get, but I think that there's sometimes an assumption of a level of skill that people have at this that,
They don't.
frankly, a lot of people don't. And so, and I'm not really trying to throw shade on, to be clear, like people who
Yeah.
are community organizers who do have these skills, who have been doing it. I just think that even the term organizer has become, one of my friends, Alex Villalpando, who comes on here sometimes, he'll say, like, what do you organize, a conference? Which is no shade to you all for organizing a conference. But his point was, that people will call themselves an organizer, but it's not really clear a lot of times what they are organizing. And so I'm just curious, kind of through that discussion of having more conversation around organizing skills, what are some of the things that you think people are looking for there, or some of the things that you think also that you see as maybe have kind of fallen by the wayside or are not as popular or well known as they used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing when people talk about organizing, and I think historically, when people are talking about campaign organizing, right? Excuse me, and that's the way in which people rightfully, I think about what organizing is. And again, as just briefly said before, base building in community, or base building at a job or workplace, base building someplace where there's a population that you're trying to reach. And how do you get that population involved in fighting for either, some change? I'll put it as basic as that. Whether or not there's some political change, as in they're fighting to get the government to do something, or fighting to get the government to not do something, right? And I think those are sort of undervalued skills or undervalued work when it comes to today organizers. And I think there is a conflict, and I would talk specifically about the Black community, around Black community organizing, around, one, I think it's in vogue to call yourself an organizer as opposed to an activist, right? So people don't like, I'm an actor, I'm not an activist, I'm an organizer. And again, that is, it's probably a better definition of where we want people to go and be organizers, but whether or not they're organizing. I think there is a controversy around the idea of either A, conferences, and or B, building schools, or which we also do in CMB, but building schools or community-based programs, survival programs, and whether or not those are classically considered organizing. And of course, I think they are not, but I think they're important to organizing. I think they're important to base building. So I do think there's a clear distinction. I think a lot of us fall on the side of wanting to do the community work, because again, I think the thing that's crept up into our movement circles has been, I don't want to be out there marching and demonstrating for what. I'm not getting arrested because I'm not going to go peacefully, even though people are going to go peaceful like they say they won't, but they probably will. But I don't want nobody like grabbing on me and all that kind of stuff, or we shouldn't be arrested. Or the classic one, I think now for us in our community is like, well, if you see what they do to white folks, you know what they're going to do to us, right? So there's a lot of rationales and reasons for not. And then there's also the idea of, again, that you are asking a dominant political apparatus to meet some needs. And I think there's a lot of folks on the other side of the envelope who are also like, and I think this is a good argument sometimes, is once you gain a victory through that policy work, the implementation of it doesn't happen the way you believed it would anyway. And so you just have me out here marching for 9 months and demonstrating and all the rest of it. And so what, right? What have we gotten? People talk about, what's happening now compared to the Civil Rights Act. I think Trump just supposedly was signing some new executive order, which in his mind, and as clouded as it is, basically erases the Civil Rights Acts or whatever like that. But the idea that they can attempt to do so, or change government structure in terms of the Justice Department and other things, which just says we just won't pick up those cases, or we won't pick up those ideas. So there's no defending of that, all that work that got that done or whatever. So I think I say all this, I think there's real discussions and issues around not only what is organizing, but what is the effective way in which we should be engaging in our community. And I answer that in this way. One, I think campaign organizing is extremely valuable, extremely useful, is the leading tool or the leading way in which you struggle within the American context outside of an actual revolutionary revolutionary militant war, right? So outside of that, organizing is our default position, and what we should be doing more of, in order to not only win some victories, but to show the power of what campaign organizing can do. But I think the community also wants to believe, and that's why in our community, the biggest organizations historically have not just engaged in organizing, they've engaged in base building through community programs, right? Whether it's the Panthers, the Nation of Islam, the UNIA. They've engaged actually in doing schools, opening up small stores, some of them cooperatives, the free breakfast programs, survival programs. All that stuff helps if that stuff helps mobilize your base to do more, then it can be impactful and effective and used. So I think there's a balance that has to be struck. I don't think both sides are, um, uh, I don't think either side works without the other, to be honest, particularly, and I'm going to point back to the Black community in terms of organizing and what people want to see, or what will make people believe that they should be involved in something, right? So I think organizing is a very specific tool and trait that people think they're doing. And a lot of times they definitely are not. And I think we've all engaged in certain levels of organizing that has turned out to sort of fall on its face, all of us. But I still think, and I think it's a hard thing to do. It's not easy to do, particularly mixed in with base building everyday people to get them to be active. So the skills that we are trying to do will be inclusive of both sides of that, right? So the skill building will include how do you build community programs, i.e. survival programs, schools, and so forth. But as Two Black mentioned, that's an organizing workshop around how do you organize in community? How do you develop campaigns? How do you develop strategies? And again, what are the goals of those things? If you repeatedly do something and nothing's come out of it, don't be shy about saying we shouldn't be doing that no more, or let's stop doing that, or let's not just do it because it makes us feel good, or we gave out free food to a particular population, but that population is not in a position to ever organize, at least not right now, right? They may need social service work, they may need social service help, wraparound services, but that population is not going to be the leading edge of militant struggle. As a left organization, should I be engaging in that work at that moment? Or should I be deciding that may not be the forefront of the work that we do? Some other group should do that. Some other group that should be doing that. But if folks are not ready, or you don't look at the population as being organizable at this particular moment, then people should shift tactics and strategies and learn from that and do something new.
Appreciated. There's some audience questions I'll pull up real quick. First of all, thanks, Charles, for the sticker and for the super chat. Passionate Rebellion asks, what lessons have us organizers learned from the BLM moment, and what will it take for us to have a reckoning about our mistakes collectively? Do you have thoughts on this?
A lot of thoughts on that. One, I just wrote a piece in Hammer and Hope. That's around where is the Black left now? Excuse me. And some of that goes into that very idea of, I think there's a lot, again, the mobilizations that took place, that continually take place around police brutality, maybe every 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. Obviously, the BLM moment was at the first moment that people in mass got up and struggled around the issue of police brutality. But and even during that moment, it was local folks who got up and struggled. But there was mass mobilizations that came out of people through the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Again, I might have some different politics around it, and I'll get into that in a second. But there should be no mistake that despite its flaws and what I feel happened, it lifted up the idea of organizing, the idea of abolition, the idea of abolishing the police. It lifted up certain strands of struggle, which, we're not prominent at that point in time, nationally speaking. Now, where I think it failed, or where I think the issues or the rub for discussions were a couple of fold. One, again, massive amount of money were poured into the idea of the organization of Black Lives Matter. But the purpose, and it was in these days, I wasn't on the inside of it, right? These days, foundations give money to organizations like them, like us, like other organizations. And there are people who have really good intentions in doing so. But part of the money that's given these days, they don't even have to tell you, don't do this or don't do that, right? The money sometimes is given for a particular purpose, but sometimes there's so much money given that it becomes a struggle over how to properly use and or operate that money. So it immediately begins to have infighting, because money is given, and then everybody begins to start grabbing at why or where that money should go, or who should control that money, to be honest, right? And how that money should be spent. And people have not made wise decisions on how that money should be spent by a long shot, in my humble opinion about it. Two, I think at some point the BLM movement got too tied to the Democratic Party, and it became similar. It became, from my point of view, something that was overly reliant on passing policy ideas, which the Democrats never had any intent of passing, but they wanted to find another way into getting the Black vote, right? Another way to shore up Black vote. And I think that became something we became very close to it. I think the celebrity culture that came out of Black Lives, it wasn't like they invented it, right? Don't get me wrong. My trajectory of this stuff is usually in a modern era, right? It's kind of like, you had your Jesse Jackson, your Al Sharpton, your Van Jones, and then you had the Black Lives Matter moment. And I think somebody should write a book, a critical book on Van Jones and his role in moving tremendous amount of money into spaces, using left language, and corrupting those spaces and corrupting the politics, but winning fame out of it. And, Van Jones, when I met him, he was a communist. And before that, he was a revolutionary nationalist, and now he's, I don't know, a moderate neoliberal at best. But I think that those things that came out of it were those things I think were purposefully, by sort of like liberal media, corporate media, where they begin to lift up certain people to be the spokespeople of movement. And when you hear some of these folks speak, you can tell that they've never been engaged. Some of them had never been engaged in organizing before. Some had been, and some were, again, in my estimation, corrupted, and some just were overwhelmed, to be honest. So I don't. But I think there was strong mobilization and organizing that came out of that moment, locally and nationally, at different points of it. But I think it was undone by all the contradictions. And at this stage, whether or not we're going to have a real collective struggle around what happened, I don't even know if I think that's possible or needed. As much so as I think, we need to continually learn the lessons that were just laid out as to why that movement mobilized, or was part of, under the umbrella of mobilizing millions of people. But yet, I don't think we can really point to advances for our larger struggle that have now lasted post the heyday of that movement, right? Whether or not folks have, my estimation, liberated territory and taken over communities, whether they set up survival programs or schools, whether or not they've organized locally to take over neighborhoods or to redirect the politics of a city. I'm not saying, again, these things are easy things to do, but with the amount of resources that were at hand, they should have been part of the strategy, which seemed to be part of the strategy, as opposed to some of the things that were reflected in terms of how folks operated, what they did, how resources were spent. Some of that stuff, I think has already been talked about a lot, but I think some of it speaks to how our movements get captured, and how our organizing, even when we think the resources matter, the resources can be important, but if we use them in ways which just reinforce capitalist behavior in politics, then we are basically doomed to not do anything with those resources, but have some individuals make a lot of, get richer, to be honest. So.
Thank you for that. Few different questions from the chat. Also, shout out to Black and the campaign to free the Pendleton 2. I know that's going to be, as you mentioned, part of what's going on there as well in Indiana. And so somebody asked a question that I actually think is a great question to ask you, because I know this is something that you have organized around, which is ideas of how to make room for your organization in a gentrifying city borough.
That's the heart of some of our work is So although we have 9 chapters, we started here in Atlanta, Georgia, and we work in a particular neighborhood. We work all over the city, but our foundation is in a particular neighborhood in Atlanta that's called Pittsburgh, which was historically a community started in 1883 by formerly enslaved Africans. Through its history, it has remained both a working class and middle class Black neighborhood up until the ending of formal Jim Crow, where it became more of a working class and poor Black community during the Great Recession. It bottomed out over 50% vacancy rates. Excuse me. Although it was a 98% Black community, now it's upwards of like 88 to 90%, which is high for Atlanta. Atlanta's going from a city that was 60% Black to one that is now 48% Black. But during this time period, this neighborhood has begun to gentrify. And gentrification in Atlanta is going from north to south, and this area is in the southern part of Atlanta. We started off with one community house that we purchased for about $50,000 through a donation. Today, that house, about now 10 years later, is worth over 350 to 400,000, and that's on the low end of the neighborhood. There's houses now being built in the Pittsburgh area that are now valued at $900,000, $800,000, and so forth. What we've done is use some of the resources that we have gotten through some of the work that we've done, a little pre-Cop City, but during Cop City, in my estimate, not to overhire in terms of hiring a bunch of people and then having to worry about continually making salary, right? That obviously becomes an issue once you start to hire a bunch of people. But we started to also buy property with some of the resources we got. So, excuse me. So we now own 4 houses in Pittsburgh, that area of Atlanta, what we call workforce housing for organizers, where we have folks who roommate together, who live in the housing in exchange for cheap rent. And at least at this stage, people getting a monthly payout of like $1,000. They give us, as a larger organization, 15 to 20 hours a week to organize in the community. We also own a farm that we bought outside of the community, but we use that farm and the produce produced and the connections to grocery stores that the farm already had to help support our survival program. We own other commercial properties that we're trying to build on. So we've tried to, and we do, everything from yard signs in terms of stopping gentrification, yard sign campaigns, petition campaigns. In the past, we've actually gone to open houses and did petitions and marches and demonstrations, and the real estate developers really hate us when we do that stuff. One point we're back involved in, I guess we're really back involved in the neighborhood association. We did a lot of work in some ways trying to change the neighborhood association. I like to use the word takeover, but people don't like me to use that word. Change neighborhood association so there wouldn't be pro gentrification, because in some ways a lot of the leadership was pro gentrification to get them. They are the first line of defense in this particular community because of how neighborhood associations are constructed. They can say no to new projects, to variances, and the city council person doesn't have to follow their no, but it's kind of tradition that they would have to have a good reason to not to. So it's a way of doing some stopgap stuff. So there's ways, again, and I think this is extremely important work, and I think it's hard work, right? You have working class and poor folks who are trying to live their lives, trying to survive. We also give out resources to people who help pay their rent and utility bills to stay in the neighborhood. But folks are trying to live their lives, right? And they don't think, again, it's the weakness of the left. Folks don't think of organizing as the way in which they are going to survive or whatever. A lot of times folks will, if the rent is due and they can't pay it, they'll just move out and surf, right? And couch surf or do other things like that. So the work is trying to get people to believe that we can effectively make change through base building and organizing and doing community work together. And it's very hard work, but I think it's the essential work of Black organizers today, as our communities are under attack more than ever, I would say, in different ways, more than in a very long time, overtly and directly. Let me be more precise. base building to get people to believe in organizing and to protect our communities in terms of self-defense and defending communities is extremely important work and hard work. We also do community walks for safety and watching the police. So there's a bunch of things that all of us need to think about, and some of this we will discuss at the conference. How do we do this working community that begins to bring people together to fight, to own community, to have power in community, and not to be forced out of it because the mayor and the developers and the city council have decided to target your community for taking over, right? So yes, we've written some things about it. We probably need to write more, but it's a very extremely important part of our work. And I think even work that is still undervalued, work that has historically been done by our organizations. Again, SNCC did this kind of work. The Panthers did this work. Other organizations did this work. We left this work behind for too much in terms of a balancing act, too much downtown work, too much let's get into her room and talk to the elected officials without the base building or bringing all those folks down to be there with you. We kind of left that work behind. And I think that's the work that is extremely important to building our base, or building out the ability to struggle and to fight the oppressive forces that are coming against us.
Right on. If I look distracted and looking at my phone, it's because Two Black is sending me a PDF to throw on the screen. So here we go. So he sent the program over so people could just kind of take a look at it. Yeah, once again, too, this is if you go to communitymovementbuilders.org, you can sign up. You won't see all of this. This is beautiful work, by the way.
It is beautiful work. Yeah.
But yeah, this is the schedule. You can see some of this: opening plenary, breakout sessions, so on, program highlights. Some of the people, I mean, this is a good thing to shout out some of the people who will be there: Dr. Sharice Burton-Stelly, Darika Purnell, Akinyele Emoja, Malika Jabali, Kali Akuno. Yeah, a lot of great folks. Shout out to Erica Keynes. Many
Jamu was there. Ashanti Austin, former Black Panther Party member. Ashaki Binta. Yeah. Randolph Carr. So, and we should also say that some of the organizations that are making up the group, and I think that's it's at the end of the program. Not only last time we did the conference, it was a Community Movement Builders sponsored conference. This time around, again, because of the desire to reach a larger section of our people and to make this something that we collectively as radical organizers hold, we invited other organizers to be a part of being the convening of this particular conference, and hopefully in the future. And so, Black Men Build, Community Movement Builders, Black Alliance for Peace, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, other organizations will also be represented. So it was really important for us to make sure that, again, conferences by themselves won't solve anything, but conferences can be gathering spaces and even getting organizations to work together closely to learn the work that we're doing together. And National Black Liberation Movement, let me make sure I say their name. That it's important for us to hold space, to Cooperation Jackson also. So it's important for us to hold space together, to organize together, and to learn how to work together so that we're not siloed into our own individual organizations. And again, that's one of the things that we hope come out of this conference, that this will be a building block for all of these different formations to begin to think about working together more often in this kind of collaborative way. Again, not only in this conference, but future campaigns, things that may come out of the ending sections of the conference. So this is a way for us to say, we need to build a Black left, a Black radical left. And that's not just one organization. That is a confluence of interests, of organizations and collectives, other organizations besides the ones that are going to be there convening this. How do we begin to do that? How do we begin to pull some, or even organizations who some of us believe are not left enough? How do we pull them towards the left, right? So part of the work of an organizer is to pull people into the fold and you only, kick those out who already, it's obvious that they're agents of the state. But if that's not the case, how do you pull them into the fold? How do you have rational discussions and debates through our differences to be like, these are the things that we agree upon enough to work together on. These are things that we're going to continue to struggle, both privately and publicly sometimes. But let's do it in a way, as much as possible, not always possible, but let's do it in a way which allows us the freedom to continue to work with each other, as long as we see that basis of left thought, of left ideas, of pushing a politics that is anti-capitalist and that is about Black self-determination from our point of view. How do we do that? How do we organize together? And this conference is a basis of trying to get that done.
Right on. Yeah, Craig asked a question, and I think you kind of just answered it there. How can these entities come together outside the structure of a revolutionary party? What did Lenin say about this? I mean, I think that's some of what you're trying to figure out, right? Is like, what is, if we're not all going to be in one organization together or one party together, then what does this, as you said, unity but not uniformity, and these spaces of disagreement, what does our relationship to each other look like?
And I think I'll say real quickly, just because I've been thinking about this, and I'm one of these people who are like, I don't need permission, just like, let's just try it and see what happens or whatever like that. But I think one of the other things that we need to do, even post this conference, is what is the multinational left doing? What do our other left formations, or like, are there? I know there's different conferences that happen, but are they organizing conferences that are meeting these other needs also? Whether or not people are over communists, socialists, anarchists. How do we break down, again, some of those even ideological differences enough so that we are working together? And so my next step, or my next hat trick, might be in 2026 with you, Jared. We may be organizing a conference of sort of multinational folks to be like, how come we're not even working close together? I know some people are and all that kind of stuff, but it feels like there's a certain segment of our organizing grouping that also needs, that's outside the Black community, of course, that needs closer cohesion. That is, as I like to say, left of the Democratic Party, so that, again, we're not getting sucked into those politics. How do we fight and struggle and figure out what are the strategies and plans for a militant left radical apparatus to position ourselves, to reach more people, and to protect ourselves against the state as much as we can, and to organize together. Excuse me. And how do we make that organizing happen? And I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize for the small coughs.
No worries. I think the allergies too right now this time of year, like they make my throat kind of itch sometimes. All right, that's great. So somebody else asked another question, which is whether, at future convenings you might consider doing virtual presentations by Africans doing revolutionary work in the global South, whether that's on the continent or probably places like Colombia or Brazil, also where there are large Black left kind of formations and so on.
Yes, our first conference, we did have a panel, particularly around Pan-Africanism. Excuse me. This one, we focused more on, let's say, the internal. Even though we know the internal, what's happening here in this country does not separate itself from what's happening internationally. And so the clear answer to that is yes, yes, yes. And even in terms of what we should be doing, the second panel, I think that's clearly the place where we're going to have those discussions also around trying to have not just a conference or gathering, which is, let's say, US centric for us as organizers. And many of us have connections already internationally, whether that's Haiti, Jamaica, Kenya, other places on the continent. How do we pull that together again and be a part of pulling that together, or join something that's already happening, so that we can say, let's join forces and make sure that this conversation is happening, so we're not missing each other all across the world and the globe, right? Because most of us truly believe, again, in Malcolm, if Africa is not free, we're not free, right? If Africa is not strong, then it makes us weaker. It doesn't give us an opportunity to be, politically speaking, a powerful force that capitalist countries have to deal with, right? We have to lift up what's happening in the Sahel and some other places in Africa currently in terms of stronger left forces, self-determining forces fighting back against U.S. imperialism. We have to lift that up, and then we have to be honest, join forces in a lot of ways, so that work can be protected, and that we can have protection for the work that we're doing. So that's a longer way of saying yes to your question. We definitely intend to continue to do that and to do it better, if not at this conference, at the next gathering we do.
Awesome. That's great. All right, I'll let you get out of here on this one. This has been great. Reminder again, folks, you can go, the link is also in the show description, but you can also go to communitymovementbuilders.org, and right at the top of the screen there's a button you can push to register for the conference. And things will also be, if you're not able to attend, Black Liberation Media will be covering as much of the conference as they can share out publicly. So somebody said, I love that childcare is available. Can Kamau talk more about the importance of our movement being family oriented? I'm trying to convince my family, who just sees me as the weird political one. I think a lot of us have had some version of that experience. But yeah.
No, I think it's obviously extremely important. We were just having this conversation the other day about friends and family, about being politicized, but not attempting to be political with your friends and family, because either you want to keep a separate space or you don't know how to move them, but how it's important just to drop things on them about what your activities are and what you're doing. So that it's, let's say the state does pick you up, or someone does try to publicly malign your character for being an organizer, and the media goes to your friends and family, and they, to be honest, they should talk to you. They were like, oh, he was always involved in that weird stuff, or whatever like that. If we're not politicizing the people directly around us, and that obviously includes partners and spouses and children and cousins and parents, then we are missing golden opportunities and not doing our work as organizers. So one of the things, reverting back to the Black Liberation Army, some of the folks who got busted, they one of the ways in which they busted them and that they had people testify against them was that their partners were not as political as they were. So their partners were not all of them, but some of their partners were not able to withstand questioning from the state. They were made scared. They were threatened. They were told what would happen to them and their offspring and their family members. And they caved because they were not politicized. They were thought of as sort of separate from the political process that people were engaging in. And so the question becomes, how can you say you're out there politicizing the community, politicizing people who you haven't met, but yet you haven't taken the time to work with your own family? And so having childcare at the conference and having political activities in the childcare, as folks are leaving their kids doing things that are political in nature for them. Sending your kids to political camps. There's Camp Pumzico that the X Grassroots Movement does. Sending them to political camps so that they can get this information or knowledge, and it becomes part of their standard culture. One of the things that happens to us all the time is that we are awash with propaganda from the other side. And so we're always battling to politicize people because other folks, we ourselves, like, we grow up into it, right? We fall back into patterns of what the state told us was right and wrong, or what we learned in our history class about America and what it's built on, and talking about the Constitution in very revered terms, and that becomes part of our pattern and DNA of discussion also. So if we're not breaking out of those patterns, then we'll always be fooled into thinking, oh, we're just going to get some new legislation and that's going to free us or liberate us. Because if we do that, then the system will operate correctly. The system was built to survive, but more importantly, it was built to survive for the interests of capitalist interests and white supremacist interests. And until we directly attack that, we're never going to be free and liberated in this land.
A great place to take us out of here. I really do appreciate that you're doing that. Also as a parent that has also, I mean, that's honestly more than any struggle around my parents, because my parents were actually very solid politically in a lot of ways. But it was just that, yeah, that intergenerational step. There's often an expectation that people will just show up as an individual into an organizing space, and if they have kids or whatever, like that's their own problem to figure out. And I think that it's a really important thing to be able to offer that. And I love the politicization too, because a lot of times it can just sort of be, if there is childcare, it's just kind of like babysitting or whatever, and it's great for kids to be able to get those messages by somebody who's thinking intentionally about, like, okay, how am I gonna make this something that kids can get into and it's appropriate for them, but also can be politicizing at the same time. So, because that's also not an easy balance to strike, as people know, is like, because you start politicizing people, you get into like really dark stuff a lot of times. And
Mhm.
doing that appropriately in the way that makes kids want to kind of get inquisitive and interested in it, as opposed to like shutting them down or saying like, I don't want to be part of that, dad. You're in some
Mhm.
weird kind of cult situation or something over here. Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. So that's great
Mhm.
that y'all are doing that.
We're trying. We're trying. I had my kid tell me, for some reason he thought that Dr. King was killed in Ohio. And he was like, "That's where Dr. King was killed. You can't go there." I had some conference there. And I was like, first, no. Second, no one's trying to kill me. But those that when that's not professionals do it, because I'm kind of like a linear, straightforward. It's like, oh yeah, the state killed him, 1968, shot him, blah 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 blah. Hopefully, like it hasn't driven them away. They're very politicized, but yeah, there probably were better methods to describe.
It's challenging too. I mean, yeah, we'll wrap up, but I just say,
Yeah.
like, with my own kids, they get so much misinformation in school. And
Mhm.
then that's also a challenge,
Yeah.
because it's like you don't want to teach them that everything their teachers are telling them is a lie, but also like, well, that's not exactly the whole story there, or that's
Yes.
maybe not the message you should take away from Dr. King's life or something like that. Um yeah, that's a whole other, I don't know. I need to do more conversations. I know that there's a book that was written, and one of my friends was actually did a piece in it. And Kim Wilson, that I used to work with on Beyond Prisons, did a book on abolitionist parenting. And I just think that there's a lot of discussion about how, as somebody who is radicalized, do you deal with these things, especially if you're not. I mean, some people do it like they do the whole unschooling approach or whatever, and they actually educate their own children. And I think that's one approach, but not everybody also is able to kind of do that,
Yeah.
because it also means work wise and everything else, it can be challenging to balance that. So, yeah, anyway.
No, we're why again.
um
I know we're trying to get off, but why again? In terms of people talking about what is organizing, why sometimes organizing alternative schools is a good idea, or after school programs or Saturday programs, because those things help even the political people have a place to drop their children off, so that they can be, excuse me, taught by people who have more knowledge or information. And again, the community folks can drop their kids off and get some of this stuff too. My daughter, who's 12, this year her history teacher taught, they had some section on propaganda, and the example was Mao, during the Cultural Revolution. And so I had to break out books. I was like, oh god, no, no, no. But yeah.
oh man, that's actually a wild place to go to for a 12-year-old conversation around propaganda, like.
It was
All right.
any way to talk about communism in a negative. It's like, aha, this is where we're gonna fit it in. This is where we're gonna fit it in.
Well, right on, man. I appreciate you coming through and sharing about this. I hope people, it sounds like people are already signed up. I hope people who have not and can do. And if they're not able to, then definitely check out the sessions on Black Liberation Media as well. And yeah, thanks for this and all the work that you do.
Thanks so much, Bob, for having me. I appreciate you.